Hello, fascinating topic today as we are going to discover how the largest Muslim majority country in the world, by population, Indonesia, has become a territory where Islam is now the dominant religion. The Islamic history of this country is relatively recent, beginning around the 14th century. But then, what religion did the inhabitants practice before that? Why and how did the territory become Islamized? What are the consequences for modern Indonesia? We are going to answer all of this right away. I give the floor to my friend for this topic. Averroes, a skilled member of the Herodotus label, specializes in Islamic history, which he approaches with great seriousness, and that you will want to discover after this mini documentary. Before giving the floor to Averroes, let's provide some context. The Indonesian territory's geography and strong monsoon winds made it ideal for commerce, as shown on the screen. In fact, the territory quickly found itself on the Middle East-China maritime trade axis, passing through the Indian subcontinent. This allowed local populations to participate by serving as a stopover and integrating into this trade axis. This allowed them to export a number of the territory's natural resources while creating a very close relationship with both the Indian subcontinent and China, as you will quickly understand. As for a precise start to all this, it is difficult to determine due to a lack of precise sources. Indeed, this is one of the recurring issues when talking about Indonesian history. But historians believe that all this was put in place during the first centuries of the Common Era. The abundance of resources and trade enables the rise of small, relatively isolated kingdoms, but through which will occur what historians sometimes call the Hinduization of Indonesia. And this from the 4th century of our era, the Hindus. But what were they doing there? It's possible with the Silk Road. Sometimes 2 or 3 show up. An indigenous animist religion was previously developed. The combined effect of trade relations between the different territories of Indian cultural power at the time, coupled with the arrival of types of missionaries in the archipelago, will allow the emergence of Hinduism and Buddhism within the territory. Hinduism and Buddhism become entrenched in Indonesia over time while adapting to pre-existing beliefs and local realities. The powerful Sriwijaya kingdom on the island of Sumatra will begin to emerge from the 7th century. Who is this one, whose rulers bore the title of Maharaja, as in India, were Buddhists and whose power was essentially based on its maritime economic activities. Other minor kingdoms, also Indianized, also make their appearance, and they were generally Hindu or Hindu-Buddhist. Subsequently, the Sriwijaya kingdom, as well as some other minor states in the area, will actively seek to firmly insert themselves into the trade flows to China, thereby increasing the ties with Chinese territory and Chinese political influence in the area. In fact, relying on its solid trade and aggressive diplomacy, the kingdom at its peak around the 10th century controlled a significant territory, notably covering 2/3 of Sumatra, as well as briefly almost all of Java. Historians also believe that at this time, the Arab world was well aware of this territory, which was known for its tin, ivory, spices, precious wood, camphor, and more. At this time, the Sriwijaya Kingdom's ports were frequented by merchants and travelers from all over Asia, especially China. As you've understood, it's also a period of material and cultural prosperity for Indonesian Buddhism. At the beginning of the 12th century, trade with territories to the west of Indonesia, that is, mainly the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East, but also potentially the East African coast, is becoming increasingly present at the expense of Chinese trade, which is declining. It is during this period that contacts with Muslim merchants from both the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent are multiplying, recently fallen into the hands of Muslim conquerors. In the 13th century, the kingdom of Sriwijaya declines, leading to regional instability and numerous conflicts, which will allow the emergence from the island of Java of the Indo-Buddhist kingdom of Majapahit, which reaches its peak in the following century. It is from this moment that the presence of Islam in Indonesia will begin to truly take shape. And to tell you all about this, I leave you in good hands with Romain from the Averroes channel. Oh, sorry, excuse me. It was just that I was a little bit distracted because I was reading a book that was super interesting, by the way, which teaches us a lot about life. All of this, so I had been a little bit elsewhere. I wasn't necessarily thinking about the video. All of this, so, well, anyway, what? So here I am. I'm Romain from the Averroes channel, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Islamization of Indonesia. Islamization in the region started in the early 13th century and significantly accelerated during the 15th and 16th centuries. This Islamization is first carried out by Muslim merchants who, before the 13th century, were already present in India and traded with regions further east. For example, ships would leave from Muscat in present-day Sultanate of Oman, transit through India, make numerous stops in Southeast Asia, and eventually reach Chinese ports. It's important to realize that Muslim merchants of that era were more than just traders. It's not like today where when we practice a profession, we practice it in a particular field. Back then, merchants could also be religious figures, missionaries. This inevitably accelerated the Islamization process. But before we go any further, a little clarification is necessary. Simply to define this term, Islamization, that I use for the sake of simplicity, but which in fact covers two different meanings, and above all, two different degrees. First, the first meaning and the first degree. Conversion. Yes, Islamization begins first with the conversion of a person. But that doesn't mean that this person truly knows and applies the practices of Islam, as well as its rules, notably the Muslim law, the Sharia. That's the first meaning of Islamization, an Islamization that is, of course, very partial. And the second meaning is therefore the understanding and application of Muslim practices and norms. And that is accompanied by the creation of Islamic schools, mosques, etc. So, when I talk to you about Islamization for the 13th century, you should mainly understand the beginning of conversions. We are not yet dealing with Muslims who have a great knowledge of their religion. In short, Islamization in Southeast Asia began in the 13th century, and it's not simply due to traders from the Middle East, since the converted populations, especially the Indians, also spread Islam to the east. As for Indonesia, the first conversions are believed to have taken place on the island of Sumatra, particularly in the cities of Aceh and Perlak. Marco Polo's testimony from the late 13th century during his stop at the port of Perlak provides evidence on this matter, and he tells us the following. Perlak is a Muslim enclave in a non-Muslim environment. If we refer to the words of Marco Polo, so we understand that Islamization did not affect the entire island of Sumatra, but touched specific areas, especially ports like that of Aceh. A century later, it's the great traveler Ibn Battuta who visits Sumatra. His account suggests that Islamization has advanced rapidly. According to him, various Islamic institutions had been created. There was a sultan, legal schools, and qadis. But not that. And then are the qadis purely Islamic? That's completely stupid. Anyway, more seriously, the qadi was sort of a judge with a very broad role. And, according to Ibn Battuta, these qadis were not just Muslims, but shurafas, that is, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So, in the 14th century, Islamization really started, but on the other hand, in quite restricted areas, mainly under Matra, and in some ports like that of Aceh. Moreover, the Great Plague of 1348 and the subsequent decline of the Mongols accelerated Islamization. Previously, trade between the Middle East and Asia was done in two ways. On one hand by sea through the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and on the other hand by land passing through Iran. And all the countries ending with AN, Turkmenistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, etc. All of this, of course, to mainly go to China. These land exchanges were mainly possible thanks to the Mongols' domination over these regions. Thanks to what is mainly called the Pax Mongolica, the territories crossed by trade routes were very secure. Except that the decline of the Mongols, weakened by internal political divisions and the ravages of the Black Plague, will undermine this organization. With land routes having become dangerous, trade would quite logically shift towards the maritime route. This implies an increasing number of merchants will move to Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. Between the 13th and 14th centuries, many conversions took place, and the first question that interests us is, who converts? And on this point, historians are quite divided. However, they agree on one point. The first conversions occurred in Sumatra, particularly in Aceh, during the 13th century. Historians retain two models of conversion. A top-down model, where the sovereign would be the first to convert and would lead to the conversion of his subjects. And a bottom-up model, where the subjects would convert, which would force their sovereign to imitate them. So basically, for Sumatra, we retain both hypotheses. First of all, it is very likely that ruling dynasties from both present and past converted as early as the beginning of the 13th century. Islamic funerary steles found on site provide evidence for this claim. For instance, this is true for Malik al-Shah, a reigning sultan who excelled in the late 13th century. You may wonder why these rulers converted to Islam. It's because we're not living in a fantasy world, at least I don't believe so. And of course, one does not convert solely out of simple religious conviction. Historians have identified 5 elements that could have motivated the conversion of political leaders. The first is religious conviction, which we cannot entirely dismiss. The second is marriage policy. This might have been the case with Malik al-Shah, who married the daughter of the Muslim ruler of Perlak. Finally, the third motivation, the threat. Yeah, everyone knows there's nothing like a threat to make someone bend, right? Or rather, to make him believe things he absolutely does not believe in. Simple, basic. Fourth motivation, a conditional conversion. Basically, the sovereign converts, and in exchange, he receives military aid from the Muslims. And fifth motivation, and not least, the distinction from other powers. Indeed, in the 13th century, 2 dynasties dominate the region: the Buddhist dynasty of Srivijaya, located south of Sumatra and then on the decline, and the Hindu dynasty of the Majapahits, which is experiencing a real boom around Java. So, quite logically, some dynasties will decide to convert to Islam to no longer remain in the shadow of these 2 powers that dominate the region. We will now discuss the second model of conversion, bottom up, from the subjects to the sovereign. In this process, the first actors are Muslim merchants. As I was telling you before, to get to China, the traders would stop over in the ports of Indonesia, in Maluku, in Pasay, in Aceh, or even in Perlak. And during this stay, it was not uncommon for some Muslims to marry a local woman, thereby leading to her conversion. And in turn, the new wife will gradually convert her surroundings. Small cores of Muslim families are created in Indonesia, all from a single man. Other actors also come into play, such as Muslim missionaries and mystics, who were sometimes also merchants. They also marry and proselytize, that is, they seek to convert the people they interact with. After this first phase of conversion, we then witness a second phase, that of true Islamization. Mosques, religious and legal schools are built, with imams and religious teachers. In addition, some mystics organize themselves into brotherhoods, which allows for further spreading of the Muslim faith. But then once again, you're going to ask me, why Islam has so much appealed to the Indonesians? Historians see 3 elements in addition to those I presented to you earlier. The first reason is that Islam advocates egalitarian values, while Hinduism is very unequal. Converting to Islam was therefore a hope for people of modest origin to be able to rise socially. This principle also applies to some powerful individuals who were denied the right to rule due to their lowly distractions. The second element is closely linked to the first, since Islam allows for the establishment of a solid social order, a relative peace, which is of course favorable to the development of trade. Not to mention that Islamic law provides rules and a legal framework for the practice of maritime trade. Finally, one last element. The populations could consider that converting to Islam was a way to reconcile with a new God, without necessarily renouncing their old deities. This parallels with antiquity, and especially with the Romans, who had absolutely no problem accepting a foreign deity into their pantheon. On the contrary, it allowed them to receive a new protection. Well, so far we've made quite a few theories. Now we're going to see how Islam spread throughout a large part of Indonesia. Let's fast forward to the 16th century when Islam began to significantly expand its influence. In the early 16th century, Malacca was the primary commercial and religious hub for Muslims in Southeast Asia. It is from here that Muslim merchants set off for Indonesia, but other merchants from the Indian coast, notably from Gujarat and Coromandel, passed through Malacca. In 1511, the Portuguese captured Malacca. This compels Muslims to shift their trade eastward, especially to Indonesia. At that point, two ports will compete for Malacca's place as the religious and commercial center of Muslim traders. The ports of Aceh in Sumatra and Johor in present-day Malaysia. The rivalry between the two ports and the arrival of Europeans hastened the Islamization of Aceh and a significant portion of Indonesia. In addition to this, Indonesian Muslims turned away from India, where the Portuguese and the English are present, to trade directly with Arabia and the Middle East. This puts them in direct contact with Muslim orthodoxy. And even more, some Indonesian Muslims will manage to make the pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca. And these Indonesian Muslims, they will return home and of course they will actively participate in the Islamization. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Aceh was the preeminent Islamic center in Southeast Asia, from which Islam spread throughout the region. Aceh reached its peak in the 17th century under Sultans Iskandar Muda and Iskandar Thani. During this period, many mystics and theologians resided at the court of the sultans and influenced their politics. Islam spread from Aceh, converting the Gayas country and the Minangkabau region, where the ruler embraced Islam. Next, we will examine Java, a crucial Indonesian island that has experienced significant Islamization. In Java, Islam was brought, or rather reported, by Javanese merchants present in the Muslim trading post of Malacca. And so, as in Sumatra, it was the port cities that first experienced conversions. We have the example of the port of the city of Pasisir on the north coast, of Jepara in the center, and finally of Tuban, Gresik, and Surabaya to the east. But the Muslim presence is also much earlier than the 15th century, since Muslim merchants have long been stopping in the ports of northern Java. This is shown by the funerary stele of Fatima bint Maymun, who died in 1082 near Gresik. The Islamization of Java accelerated in the 15th century. The funerary stele's presence further supports this notion. That of Maulana Malik Ibrahim, who died in 1419 in Gresik, and who, according to tradition, was one of the 9 saints of Java who participated in its Islamization. These are of great importance to the Javanese, who even claim that they built the Demak Mosque, considered a major pilgrimage site. But one should not believe that it was only the Muslims, Arabs, Indians, or even Javanese who actively Islamized the population. Yes, there were also Chinese Muslims. And on this point, we have the testimony of the Chinese Mahuan, who shows that the Chinese converted to Islam, resided in Java, and built mosques there, as is particularly the case in Semarang, where the Sampakong Temple was originally a mosque. In contrast, Demak's rulers actively contribute to Islamizing their subjects. Raden Pati, described as the founder of the Muslim dynasty of Demak, was born around 1478. So it is from Demak that Islam will spread to Java and the rest of Indonesia. First, towards the city of Kudus, a name that is not random since it is close to the Arabic name of Jerusalem el-Quds. Then, Islam progresses to Jepara, a port of major importance that will allow the rulers of Demak to extend their domination by sea. This allowed them to Islamize part of Kalimantan and southern Sumatra, including the cities of Lampung and Bengkulu in the 16th century. As for Java, other cities will convert to Islam, like Banten, conquered by Demak in 1527, and many localities located in the west of Java. The Mataram dynasty then reigned from 1577 to 1775 and took over. Coming from simple peasants, this dynasty had converted to Islam to take power. Under their rule, Islam spread almost throughout Java. However, this Islam was not necessarily orthodox. In fact, it was more what is called syncretism, in other words, a set of various religious beliefs. And besides, this is not an exceptional phenomenon, since we find syncretisms in our city outside of Java, like Bima, Lombok, Minangkabau, or even Tidore. Beliefs that are still present today. So here, in fact, if we summarize a little bit what we have said so far, well, we realize that we have mainly talked about the two main islands of Indonesia, namely Java and Sumatra. And what you need to know is that there would be much more to say about other islands. And yes, it's not as if Indonesia was only made up of more than 13,000 islands. The main issue we face is a significant lack of sources, and the main academic works on the subject are necessarily interested in Java and Sumatra. Well, now, I pass the baton to the illustrious of the mystics, who will take pleasure in telling you about the following periods. This period allowed Islam to firmly establish itself in Indonesia, particularly through the kingdoms of Demak, Aceh, and Ternate, which were mentioned by Averroes. But at the same time, the Europeans begin to arrive. Just like for the Indian subcontinent, it is the Portuguese who arrive first, followed by the Dutch, who once again sniff out a good commercial deal. It is the Dutch who will most durably settle until they conquer almost the entire territory in the 19th century, and notably by founding the famous city of Batavia, which, from the 17th century served as the center of trade for the Dutch East India Company, Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, boasts a captivating and thriving history that continues to this day. To stay focused and avoid exploring the extensive topic of Dutch occupation of Indonesian territory. However, it plays a major political role in the territory. While the Portuguese coupled their settlement with a missionary will, as in India, creating numerous religious tensions within their territory and with their neighbors. The Dutch do not have this will, in fact aiding their expansion, initially perceived as less aggressive and therefore generating less resistance. However, the local populations will soon become disillusioned, as the occupied territory will be exploited and drained of its resources from the 19th century onwards, as the British were able to do in Bengal. According to historians Herman Beck and John Brewer, the Dutch presence in Indonesia and the economic pressure they impose end up causing issues. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there were various uprisings, some popular and others orchestrated by local rulers under Dutch rule. In this struggle, originally economic, but which later developed into a political military fight, being Muslim acquired a new dimension in opposition to the Christian Dutch occupier. As a result, Herman Beck specifies that the possibility of using Islam in this way in the fight to free oneself from the yoke of the colonial occupier made this religion attractive. For Indonesians who aspired to economic and political freedom and independence, Jean Brouet states that Islam has been a unifying force in the territory. The Malay language coordinated the march towards independence of a diverse territory in terms of culture and ethnicity. At the same time, colonization allows for a better connection of the territory with the rest of the Islamic world. This connection leads to the arrival of Muslim populations from other territories, allows Indonesian Muslims to make the pilgrimage to Mecca much more simply, and to have access to study stays in the countries of origin of Islam, while ultimately exposing Indonesian Muslims to new ideas. This includes, for example, the so-called modernist Islamic movement, which sought in practice to purify Islam of any improper element, a movement that intensified religious orthodoxy and hardened the application of Islamic rules and laws in Indonesia. All of this allows for the emergence of Syarikat Islam in 1911, an Islamic and economic movement that for about a decade was the Indonesian independence movement with the largest number of members. Subsequently, other independence movements will appear, whether they are communist, democratic, radical, or moderate, autonomist, or nationalist, and more or less fizzling out. As the Second World War breaks out, the Dutch Indies are occupied in 1942 by the Japanese, who are welcomed as liberators, at first until the wind turns, and who will rely on the independent leaders, Sukarno and Atta. When things go wrong for the Japanese, the Indonesians take the initiative and declare their independence in 1945. The Dutch will not manage to regain control, and Sukarno becomes the first president of an Indonesian republic that wants to be united in its ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity. This will not prevent the emergence of politico-religious movements presenting the usual prism, ranging from followers of a rigorous practice of Islam, who go as far as advocating for the Islamization of Indonesian territories, practicing other religions, even going as far as seeking to establish an Islamic theocracy, to more moderate currents that are able to get along with Sukarno's Indonesian National Party, or Indonesian National Party, which broadly swept the country's political prism. In fact, so you can imagine the situation? The 1955 elections, with 37 million voters, clearly illustrate the four parties that formed the country's political fundamentals at the time. Sukarno's Democratic and Secular Indonesian National Party receives around 23% of the vote, followed by the Nahdlatul Ulama, or Council of Scholars, an Islamist party with a centrist economic policy, which gets 19% of the votes. The Masyumi, a coalition party bringing together different Islamic currents from an economic point of view. Conservative, which gets about 17% of the votes, followed by the Communists, who get about 16% of the votes. This perfectly illustrates the Indonesian situation of the time, where Islam takes an important place on the political scene, and reconciling all of this is not obvious. Due to severe economic issues, the country is, in 1965, the theater of a coup and counter-coup with unclear motivations, where the communists oppose the central government, destabilized by the first coup, which will end up falling into the hands of an Indonesian general, Suharto. Not to be confused with Sukarno, who was the incumbent president and who is the myths of his functions. This isn't very democratic, is it? You'll finish tidying up the sergeant's office. General Suharto establishes a dictatorship and applies a particularly brutal anti-communist policy while stabilizing the country and allowing its economic recovery. He also authored a struggle against Islamists and a violent war against East Timor. Suharto left power in 1998, and the country experienced new instabilities. Today, the Indonesian president belongs to the party heir to Sukarno's Indonesian Nationalist Party, and his vice president is a former member of Nahdlatul Ulama. At the Council of Ulamas, while his opponent, Disappointed, belongs to the party heir to General Suharto, who also does not hesitate to cast a wide net, including on the Islamist side. So we observe today the strong presence of Islam in Indonesian politics, without it necessarily being the center. Islam in Indonesia today is predominantly Sunni, divided into two main trends: the traditionalist trend represented by Nahdlatul Ulama and the modernist trend mentioned earlier, carried by a movement bearing the name of Muhammad's partisan, or Muhammadiyah. As you may have identified, these two names can be confusing, since the traditionalist approach is based on practices born in Indonesia, therefore accepting syncretisms and adjustments related to history and local realities, while relying on the authority of the ulamas, while the so-called modernist approach argues for a return to the fundamentals of Islam, relying exclusively on the Quran and the Hadiths, thus rejecting any syncretism. A result of the country's history, which allows us to wrap up our topic of the day, the latest Indonesian census indicates that about 87% of the Indonesian population is Muslim today. Without distinction between the different currents, 7% of Indonesians are Protestants, all currents combined. Just under 3% are Catholic, 1.7% are Hindu, and 0.7% are Buddhists, while the rest is made up of much smaller religious communities. Thank you for your attention. I hope our work has helped you better understand Indonesia's journey. This large, predominantly Muslim country, although in some ways on the periphery of the original Muslim world. I warmly invite you to go see the channel of my friend Averos, whose link is in the description and will appear on the screen in a few moments. Of course, don't forget the blue thumb and the comment. And with that, I'll see you very soon.